is being live streamed. Okay. All right. Welcome everybody to council workshop for July 25th, 2023. As we have quorum, I will call the meeting to order. The time is 11:06. Always like to start the meeting off in a good way by acknowledging the city of Maple Ridge carried out its business under traditional and unceded territory of the Katzie First Nation and the Kwantlen First Nation. Madam Clerk, did you want to go into procedures?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded and will be available to the public for playback on our website in accordance with Council Policy 3.12. The primary purpose of a council workshop meeting is the receipt of information, review and discussion of policies and other matters of interest to council, and to make decisions related to such matters as required. This meeting is being conducted through the city's One Meeting platform. For voting purposes, council has been provided with voting cards, green for in favor, red for oppose, and yellow for point of order.
Thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor Carrera, seconded by Councillor Schiller. Any comments, questions, additions, subtractions from the agenda? Seeing none, we'll call the question. All those in favor? It is unanimous. Motion has been carried. Can I get a motion to adopt the minutes of July 11th, 2023? Moved by anyone. Councillor Youssef, seconded by Councillor Carreras. Any comments, questions for the minutes? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to item 5.1. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Mayor, the next item on today's agenda is 5.1, proposed approaches for the new City of Maple Ridge off-street parking bylaw. And Krista Gowan, Planner 2, is here to present this item for council's information only.
You have the floor.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, Council. So today we're going to be talking about the off-street parking bylaw. So there are some proposed approaches in this report. It's really a continuation from the September 2022 report that talked about, several topics that are most likely to see the most change. And so we're just continuing that conversation today, and we're really hoping to get a lot of your feedback. But before we move on, I'd like to introduce our parking consultant, Mr. Alon Weinberger today. You'll see his draft report as an appendix item to this report, and he's here to answer any questions that you might have about off-street parking. So in order to kind of dive into it, I just want to make it very clear that we're talking about off-street parking today, specifically the private property. So when we think about parking in Maple Ridge, we sometimes think about on-street parking. So if you pull up to 224th and get out, there's a curb there that's on street. That's out of scope for this bylaw. It's regulated under different bylaws. Same with the municipal parking lots. So like the garage downstairs, even though it's off street, we treat it separately in City Hall because it's municipally owned. And so we're really talking about that off-street private property. So like where you park at home, where you go get your groceries, and where you run your errands. So that private off-street parking is really the focus of this bylaw. So I'm calling it the parking bylaw, but its official title is the off-street parking and loading bylaw. It was originally adopted in 1990. It's been amended several times, 24 times, and in order to keep up with current trends. So, the payment in lieu provisions were introduced, EV charging or rough-in regulations were introduced, and the town center received its own parking regulations separate from the rest back in 2010. But overall, the parking bylaw regulates the location, number, and size of off-street vehicle parking spaces, loading spaces, bicycle spaces, passenger spaces, all to try to balance the needs of residents, commuters, and visitors. So the items on here are just some of the items that are currently in the parking bylaw, but I'm going to go through them one by one today. So I'm going to run through the presentation talking about each of them and kind of where we see the changes possibly happening. And then we'll conclude and we can go to Q&A and answer any questions, but we're really looking for that feedback. So in terms of work to date, there was a report that's also attached to this report from September 6, 2022, a council workshop, which really introduced the project, introduced, some regional parking studies, our OCP, what our area plans are looking for, and identified a couple areas that are likely to see the most change. And so that's continuing today. Since then, we've also retained Evolve Traffic Solutions. So Mr. Weinberger here today to help provide guidance on current parking trends and approaches that would be suitable for Maple Ridge. And part of this work was going out and surveying the different types of vehicles residents and visitors are driving Maple Ridge. So finding out that roughly 40% are cars, 50% are SUVs, and 10% are pickup trucks. So just, who's visiting and what people are driving in Maple Ridge. We also went out to the Transportation Advisory Committee and the Municipal Advisory Committee on Accessibility and Inclusiveness to do kind of a semi-structured activity in order to get high-level direction on 9 topics. And their feedback is also included in this report. It was just done at one of their regular meetings, and we got lots of good feedback. So in terms of why update now, it's time for a holistic update. It's been updated several times, but now it's time to take a good look at everything all at once and do a holistic review. The parking requirements can sometimes be seen as technical details, but we know it's having more and more of an impact on the design and form and function of our cities and neighborhoods. It affects, the design of housing. It affects the landscaping and how much land is dedicated to parking. Also, the transportation industry is shifting away from a one-size-fits-all. So instead of having the same requirements for every area in the city, there is the shift to go looking at different neighborhoods having different requirements, because we know different neighborhoods have different levels of car dependency, more walkable neighborhoods and stuff like that. So there's just a shift. In terms of the goals for the new parking bylaw, it's really to support the vision and goals of Maple Ridge. It's one of the levers that are there in order to help support, what's in our OCP and our strategies and our sustainability goals. It's to better align with best practices accepted in the transportation industry today, respond to emerging market trends, and overall improve the layout, functionality, and clarity of the bylaw. So as I mentioned, this is kind of just a continuation of the report from September 6th, but we're really looking for that feedback. What would you like us to turn that dial up on? What would you like us to reconsider? What would you like us to move, a little bit back on? We're here to listen to it all. So getting into it. So the first item, parking minimums, it refers to the approach of requiring a minimum number of parking spaces for each land use. So for a single detached, the minimum requirement for parking is 2 spaces. Applicants are welcome to do 4 6 spaces. We don't have maximums, but we do have a maximum lot coverage. So single detached, only 20% of their lot area can be dedicated to parking, for example. So we kind of work it that way, but we don't have a maximum of like 10 cars, for example. So in terms of potential approaches for parking minimums, we're looking at reducing parking minimums by 20% only in the town center and along the Lougheed corridor, areas that have community amenities and transit. And then we're also considering reducing parking minimums by 20% for non-market or rental multifamily apartments, potentially up to 50% with very specific criteria, such as, if an application came in that was a below market rental building, maybe reducing the parking for that application. And also looking at removing the 1 required parking space for secondary suites within the town center. There's approximately 600 single detached homes currently, but most of those are going to turn into higher denser forms moving forward. So we'll be left with very few single detached in our town center. So just to kind of provide a quick example of, when I say 20%, what are we talking about? So for a 3-bedroom apartment in the town center, if somebody was going to build that today, they need 1.2 parking spaces per unit. Reducing that by 20%, you're looking at 1 space. If you're in the Lougheed corridor, you currently have to do 1.5, looking at reducing that to 1.2. And we start to see the big reductions for the non-market or rental, especially if it's both. We're not looking at reducing visitor parking. Right now it's 0.2 spaces per unit, and we're not looking to reduce that at all. In terms of the payment in lieu program, it provides the option for an applicant to pay per parking space. It's 20,000 right now to reduce the total number of constructed parking spaces. So if someone is required to build 10 parking spaces, they can pay 20,000 per stall, and only build 9, for example. So in terms of approaches moving forward, we're looking at expanding it beyond the town center into the Lougheed Transit Corridor, presenting a tiered approach and starting the rate at 35,000. So if you're looking to only reduce by 5%, maybe starting at 35,000 and increasing the more of a reduction that you would like. And we're also proposing to index it based off the construction price index from the Vancouver region. So it goes up incrementally based off of the price index. For tandem parking generally means there's one parking space behind another. So one car isn't able to exit or has access to the driveway. Currently, the city of Maple Ridge permits 30% of the parking garages within a development to be tandem. So if there's 100 units within being developed, only 30% of those are allowed to be tandem. So moving forward, if you're outside of the town center, we're considering keeping that 30%, but expanding it to include triplex, fourplex, and other townhouses. So keeping that 30% outside of the town center, outside of areas that don't have close to transit or other community amenities. But if you're within the town center, we're considering allowing up to 75% of the total development to have tandem parking. So triplex, fourplex townhouses, if you're within the town center or the Lougheed Transit Corridor area. For accessible parking requirements, right now they likely fall short of the community's needs, and we're hoping to kind of bring them more into alignment with best practices. So for example, the parking bylaw right now does not have van accessible stalls, access aisles, or anything like that in order to accommodate those entering or exiting a vehicle through a wheelchair. So we're considering lowering the thresholds of when an accessible space is required. So opposite to what I've been kind of talking about before, we're looking to increase the minimum for accessible parking. So here on the table is just an example of how we're looking to increase. So if you have a minimum of 5 spaces, now you'll require 1 accessible space, and the numbers just kind of go up from there. So just this increase in accessible parking. We're also looking to introduce van accessible dimensions and requiring that 50% of accessible spaces be van accessible. And in the case of only one space being provided, that it should be a van accessible space, just making room for everyone. Also looking at adding access aisles, so someone is able to safely enter and exit their vehicle, update signage requirements, and then require accessible parking to be fully energized. In terms of micromobility, micromobility can include bicycles, e-scooters, segways, skateboards, etc. But right now the parking bylaw only has bike parking in the town center. So we only require it for our development applications within the town center. So we're really looking to broaden that in order so that trips can be completed. So you have parking at home and then wherever you're looking for your destination. So we're looking to increase the rate of long-term bike parking in the town center and also extend those down the Lougheed Transit Corridor. We're looking at requiring a minimum of 1 long-term bike parking space per dwelling unit throughout the city, and that those spaces should be energized. For long-term bicycle spaces, in a multi-story apartment buildings, we're looking to put requirements on where those long-term storage should be, either ground level or P1, something that isn't, down 5 levels in the dark corner, something that makes people feel safe and easily accessible, and they're not in conflict with other cars or people entering or exiting the building. We're also looking to expand short-term bicycle parking at all commercial, industrial, and institutional buildings, just to have that complete trip. And then we're also still considering requirements for e-scooter parking. We are watching the pilots that are going on around the province, including Coquitlam, and they're not going to conclude until 2024, I believe, but we're always looking for lessons learned that are coming out of those pilots. For EV infrastructure requirements, EV infrastructure generally just refers to the charging system, whether at home or in public spaces, to fuel or refuel a vehicle. Since the adoption of the city's REFTN requirements, more municipalities are, changing their bylaws to be energized. And what do I mean by energized? There's kind of three categories. We have our rough-in infrastructure, which we have right now, which means providing sufficient panel capacity and conduit to a panel. Energized means essentially you get the outlet, you don't get the charging head. It just, if you are moving into a new place, you have the outlet and you can bring your own charging head for your own vehicle. Ready to charge or fully energized would mean that there is a charging head there ready to go, that the day that it opens, it's fully energized. So we're looking at requiring 30% of parking spaces in all residential developments to be energized. So just having that outlet at occupancy, and that the remaining residential units should have rough-in infrastructure. And then we're also considering that 10% of non-residential development to be fully energized. But we're still doing some research on how to move forward. In terms of shared use parking, it refers to when there's two uses sharing the same parking spot. So, a daycare or a restaurant that have different parking demands during the day. One's more in the morning, one's more at the night. But, to have that shared parking spot be used throughout the day. So we do have provisions right now, and we're looking to update it just for clarity. We're not looking to reduce the reduction by 75% for those uses right now, just updating the wording for clarity at this point. For pedestrian experience with parking, right now the parking bylaw does not have very many provisions in there talking about lighting, signage, or landscaping, or pathways to help ensure a safe and comfortable trip from the destination to the enter and entrance of your vehicle. So, for example, you might be experiencing in new parking lots. There's this pathway that when you exit your vehicle, it leads you right to the front of the destination of where you're going. Sometimes there's trees, sometimes there's a letdown for accessible parking. Those are put in through provisions in a parking bylaw. So we're looking at introducing lighting requirements for shared surface parking and underground parking, updating signage, for visitor accessible EV assigned parking spaces. And we're really looking to introduce pedestrian walkway requirements for parking areas that have more than one commercial use or mixed use buildings that are on the same lot and have a certain size. So it wouldn't be for everyone. It would, those big surface parking lots, for example, of a big box retail, and introducing landscaping requirements as part of it. So these are just a couple of pictures to help you visualize what I'm trying to describe. That you might have seen around visiting other neighborhoods. So the next topic is shared mobility, which can be defined as a transportation service and resources that are shared among users. So often we think of EVO or Modo. Right now, there's currently no shared mobility provisions in the parking bylaw, but car share companies have been working with developers and municipalities in Metro Vancouver to implement car share programs into new developments. So we're looking to implement something similar so that maybe in the town center and the low heat transit corridor area, that every car that's being shared, a minimum of 2, that the total number of parking spaces could be reduced by 2 or 4 spaces, but we're still exploring what a maximum might look like for that. So in terms of new considerations that weren't covered in the September 2022 report, we're looking at changing our small car parking. Right now, we allow up to 10% of commercial and industrial and institutional developments to have small car parking. We're looking to raise that to 25%, but we're also looking to clearly prohibit small car parking where there's assigned residential parking spaces. So if you buy a condo, you don't get stuck with a small car, especially if you drive a larger vehicle for work. So we're looking to change that potentially. And then we're also looking to update our parking space dimensions. I've kind of discussed updating our accessible parking dimensions to meet the community's needs and be more in alignment with best practices. But we're also looking at widening the parking space dimensions of a regular space from 2.5 meters wide to 2.6 meters wide. So just a little bit of an increase in order to help, families get in and out of their vehicles a little bit more comfortably. We know cars have been getting larger over time. So we're just looking to increase dimensions a little bit. And then we also had some recommendations, as you'll see from our committees. So considering a requirement for pickup and drop-off spaces in front of apartment buildings. So that's kind of, we've been looking at that through our loading requirements that you'll see in the consultant's report. And then looking at, preferential parking spaces or like senior parking or family parking. We've been getting calls, people asking about how do we regulate those? Can we regulate those? So that's another thing that we're looking to explore. And then considering long-term parking for sitting scooters for accessibility, probably in specific uses, assisted living, requiring some space within the building to park scooters so they don't have to sit within somebody's unit if they don't need it. So in terms of next steps, we're just here for a project update right now. And we're hoping to come back to you hopefully in the fall with a draft bylaw going to COW. And should council grant first reading of that bylaw, we're proposing to send it out to a number of organizations. So UDI, Haven, the Climate Hub, Hub Cycling, for comment. It will also be posted on the city website. It's currently on the website and people are connecting with staff about it. And then we'll bring back any comments for the final reading report, which can go through second, third, and fourth because it doesn't need a public hearing because we're not amending the zoning bylaw. It's just going to be a bylaw on its own. And so this report's for information only, but I'm looking forward to your questions and your feedback today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Quite detailed, lots to think about and absorb. So at this time, we'll open it up for questions. There's no recommendation, so we don't need to post a motion. So we'll just open it up for questions. Councillor Schiller, followed by Councillor Youssef.
Thank you, Mayor Remy, and thank you very much. That was a great overview. There's lots to pick apart in there, and I definitely have some questions. But I will just say, like overall, I'm very supportive with all the recommendations that are in there. I think that it does reflect the moment in time that we are in, where we are facing a real crunch for land, for housing, for employment, and the space that's allocated for private vehicles just needs to be reduced. And I love to see the focus on providing a better experience for people who are cycling or walking or taking scooters. I support the reduction of 20% in the town center, and personally, I would support a bigger reduction. But like I say, just generally overall, I agree with the recommendations. A couple of specific questions. I still don't totally have my head wrapped around the EV charging. So I definitely support moving from roughed in up to something more. The fully charged option, if you build that in, does that work for all different types of EVs, or is there an issue there with like what brand of car somebody has when they live in a specific unit?
Through the chair, my understanding, I believe Tesla is one of the only ones that have a different head. I believe the other ones are a little bit more compatible. I'm getting a nod from the consultant. The technology does change. But most, like if you go and charge at one of our fast chargers in another neighborhood or here, like you're able to charge depending on your car. Generally, It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. fair enough. I do think it's important that we move forward with those standards as well. And something that has been suggested to me over the years, and I'm not sure if it's specifically being looked at, like I love that we're talking about the accessibility. I mean, there's a certain segment of the population that requires a private vehicle and requires to be able to really pull up to the vehicle just because physical limitations. Have we looked at all for at providing spaces for home healthcare workers? This is something that's been raised to me in the past, is that you often have Fraser Health staff or private health staff that arrive at an apartment building, say to provide care to a person. They have like a 1-hour appointment. And often they have difficulty finding parking. And I do think because that is like a healthcare based situation, that's something that I don't know what the options are, but I would like to see us looking at how we could provide some sort of pass system or something that would allow those type of workers to have ready, accessible parking. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Councillor Youssef, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff for the report and presentation, as well as our consultant, of course. My first point, Mr. Chair, has to do with the parking in lieu payments. I'm glad to see that we are increasing them and that we are fixing them to an index, as that was something that we spoke about last term, and I'm happy to see that come forward. With the increase, though, when we're looking at $35,000 through the chair, is that in line with our comparators? I see that the city of Coquitlam is mentioned in the report, but are there other municipalities of similar size, composition, and growth stage that are going with the same level of payment, or should we be further ahead of the pack, back off a little more to get within the center, or where are we?
Through the chair. So 35,000 kind of came about for two reasons. We're not ahead of the pack, but we're definitely not behind, because there's two considerations when talking about the rate. It's for the new construction, but also for property owners looking to revitalize an existing building when they change use. So for example, someone in the town center is looking to take over a new building. It's a slightly different use. The parking requirements can change. So we don't want to make it too cost prohibitive for someone to not be able to meet that parking requirement. But we also don't want to make it too lucrative for an applicant looking to just reduce the parking. So finding that balance is difficult. So thank you for your feedback on the 35,000.
No, thank you for all the hard work that you've done to try to find that balance, and more importantly, for explaining it to myself and the public in a way that we can digest and understand. Secondly, Mr. Chair, I'm a big fan of area and neighborhood specific plans, as I've expressed a few times, and would want to see parking requirements that address the needs of specific areas. Silver Valley and Albion, for example, will be different than that of the downtown and town center and Lougheed corridor area. Along with Councillor Schiller, I would be interested in more importantly, finding out why we got to the 20% reduction and seeing where further reductions could be had. So through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, how did we arrive at the reduction of 20% for the town center and Lougheed corridor?
Through the chair. So I know a municipal scan was done, but I might turn it over to our consultant, Mr. Weinberger, to provide a little more technical background on how we got to the 20% for the town center.
Hi, through the chair. So the 20%, we had several studies in Metro Vancouver. In 2012, we had the Metro Vancouver apartment parking study, and then it was renewed in 2018 with TransLink. And some of the findings of this study were that just the vehicle usage in those areas was much lower. The 20% really came to be as other municipal bylaws settled on that number. It wasn't really a magic number. Some places had even bigger or usage. Some had very like even 40% reduction, but obviously we can't really get to a point of what Maple Ridge has. And this is why we also added a provision in some of the minimums that we can also consider case-by-case basis for several applications if we have a comprehensive traffic study. But the 20% really is what we can consider across the board for now for Maple Ridge as a starting point. Thanks.
Thank you for that. As a starting point, I can appreciate that. And We'll leave it alone for now as a starting point until we have more information and more data to move forward. Third point, Mr. Chair, on the tandem parking. I've never been a fan of tandem parking. I've seen it not used for parking, and that's why. I've never been a fan of it. I would not be in favor of reducing our town center to 75%, reducing the allowance and increasing the tandem parking to 75%. I would probably be more along the lines of 50% allowance within the downtown core as opposed to the rest of the municipality to accommodate the different neighborhood. And last point, Mr. Chair, through you, is on the city-owned lots that we have in the town center, have staff and/or the consultant considered through the work that's been done, the possibility of building parkades on those city-owned lots? And of course, I would also be interested in finding private sector partners to help us not only with the construction, but the operation and possible maintenance of these parkades. Has that been a point of discussion at all through you, Mr. Chair?
Through the chair, that has been a discussion, but not within the scope of this bylaw. Obviously, we work very closely with our engineering department that really does look to the on-street parking requirements as well as our municipal parking lots. So that is a conversation I believe that they're having, how do we have build out municipal parking lots? We look at it from like, how can we do municipal parking lots in future development? So that's something that the planning team has definitely been considering through development, but in terms of how those municipal lots are going to move forward, I don't have any answers because it's a little bit out of scope for this report right now. I don't know. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay.
I could go after that. Through the chair. It's not working.
No.
There we go.
Hello?
That should be on.
Okay.
Oh, when it goes green. Oh.
So just a note from Mr. Halpin, who presented here a couple of weeks ago. A note regarding a town center parkade, that it was actually not recommended. A desktop assessment was completed in 2022. The cost per parking stall was in the range of 50,000 to 90,000, dependent on geotechnical, land costs, and type of facility. So generally it was not recommended. And if you want more information, Mr. Halpin could brief you more later in the fall.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you stepping in for Mr. Halpin while he's not here. And I certainly appreciate that the conversation is being had. I am shocked to see that it was not recommended. Costs can be prohibitive in some cases. But again, I'm glad that at least the conversation is being had, and let's continue to have that conversation and see how to best utilize the space that we have in our downtown core. Okay. Thank you to staff. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions and comments.
Thank you. Councillor Carreras, followed by Councillor Duick.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report. It was fun reading. I do like the discussion around neighborhood approach. I think Maple Ridge is serviced by transit in a variety of ways, and the further east you go, it's quite stark, actually, the lack of transit. My son had to take transit from Victoria last week, and it took him 8.5 hours, almost 4 hours just from Tsawwassen to Maple Ridge, which included a 30-minute walk because, buses don't run. And I'm 240th. So that's not even East Maple Ridge. When we lived in Pitt Meadows, it's a stark difference around the accessibility for transit, even on the west side of Maple Ridge. And so I'm a huge supporter of looking at this as a neighborhood piece. I appreciate that we've started with the town center and the Lougheed corridor as two areas to look at, but I think we also need to look at the west side as decreasing some of the parking on the west side because they do have access. Whereas Silver Valley and even Albion, it's, my kids can't even get home after work at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. They have to Uber home. So I think there are some significant differences from one part of our community to the other. The other thing that I think is important, because we are doing so much work on transit, and even in the last 5 years, we have seen increases, that I think that whatever bylaw we deal with, I would love to see like a stepped approach to implementation of this, or the ability that it comes back to us every 2 years or 3 years, whatever is a as an appropriate cycle, because as transit is expanding, and I know that we're doing what we can to increase transit here, we may be able to decrease that parking as we go forward. The one thing I found what was missing that I really hoped was in the report is, and I think Councillor Youssef spoke about this, is I would have loved to have seen the comparables that were used. There was talk in the report that they looked at, I think, Poco, Port Moody, Langley City, Chilliwack. But I would have loved to have seen, like, this is what we found in these communities, so that when we're making these decisions, we actually can know where we fall between Chilliwack and Langley and Port Coquitlam. And then some of the demographics are really helpful in that decision too, right? Do we have a lot more SUVs in our community because we have more families in other communities? And can we break that out by neighborhood as we start to look at decreasing parking? The other thing, so the EV charging, thank you for doing EV charging. The one thing I think we need to look at is was it the shopping commercial? Only 10% recommendation for being energized. And, we are moving forward in a way that people are driving more and more electric vehicles. And if this is a forward thinking, I think 10% is maybe for the now. I have a plug-in electric hybrid, which is a lot of people do drive. So you get 50 kilometers electric and the rest is gas. So I'm always looking for charging in charge. And so I do appreciate when I go to Coquitlam Center, I can plug in at Coquitlam Center, but there aren't any sort of commercial areas here. So I'm wondering if we want to increase that with a forward-looking vision that more and more people will be looking to charge as they're doing their usual errands. Shared mobility. I've talked about this before, and I think this is huge for me. I've seen this work with, let me know when I'm getting to my limit too. With friends that live closer to the city. With my own child living in Victoria, he uses Evo a lot. He doesn't need a car except for once a month he needs a car. And I think that this is going to aid us in being able to reduce those parking spots, is being able to make sure there is a place for Evo. And I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Do we create the Evo or Moto, I don't want to just be one specific shared mobility spots, and then maybe they'll come out here one day. But I also think do we just think about shared mobility on the LTC in the city center? Because I see in Maple Ridge that if we have shared mobility actually outside of city center, and I may be totally crazy here, but that will actually allow people to use transit if they're able and have less vehicle dependence, if they're able to get to those transit centers from outside. All good with pickup and drop off. I think that as we reduce parking and people are going to have to go further and further away from their intended area to park, we do need to make sure there is a space for those with mobility, especially for those that are aging in our community. On the going out to, once the bylaws in place going out, looks like we're going to have an UDI hub and climate hub. I'm wondering if we're missing an accessibility piece there. Is this something like Rick Hansen? I think is it the Rick Hansen Foundation that deals with accessibility? I'm wondering if this is something that we send out to them. Havan and UDI are developer based. Hub is cycling, and the climate hub is around our climate pieces, but it doesn't talk about the other things. Do I have time for one question?
Yes.
Sorry. On the electric scooters, I was very much in favor of electric scooters. And then I spent a week in a city that has electric scooters, and it changed my mind a little bit. What are the regulations around safety? Like, it was downright scary what I witnessed with the electric scooters. So if we expand to electric scooters, what is the requirement to wear helmets, to ride them responsibly? And what is the legal requirement for us?
So through the chair, the short answer is right now the pilots are happening to try to legalize them into legislation so that they're legal. And so the pilots, for example, Coquitlam is running the pilot with all of those safety requirements in place. Helmets, reducing your speed, getting off when there's a pedestrian. They have like a whole list, and they're hosting workshops. So right now, those are the pilots to kind of bring it into legislation. They're not really allowed right now. But for this bylaw, we're considering, what does parking for these look like? Because we've heard throughout these pilots that sometimes they're just left out. And, regular bike racks don't really work. So if they were to come into legislation, kind of having that forward thinking of what does parking look like so they can be organized on the street.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. And I know there's work being done at it. And I do drive past the ones in Coquitlam all the time, and I do see helmets hanging from them. It was in another community where there was no helmets, no safety, people riding in the middle of the roads. It was a bit crazy. So I'm just wondering what is the requirements, and as it goes through legislation, it'll be good to make sure that this is an important mode of transportation, active transportation, and how do we make sure it's done safely in our community? I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And moving on to Councillor Dewick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. It was very thorough and appreciate all the work to date. So for me, I'll start with the tandem. I'm like Councillor Youssef, and I think you heard this last term. Tandem parking does present challenges. It is something that we hear complaints about, and it's mainly because people don't use them. It's kind of like double garages. People don't park in their garages, hence why there's problems in the neighborhood. So I think the neighborhood approach is something, and I mean, you have noted it, like with the town center and the corridor and that. So Silver Valley's needs are quite different, as was mentioned, than Hammond, for example, because of the close proximity. One of the challenges when we do compare with other cities is we are not similar because we don't have the same level of transit. So when we get recommendations that suggest a 20% reduction, I'm assuming it's based on the fact too that we want transit opportunities. We want people to utilize transit, but right now we still don't have adequate transit, certainly in the town center and the Lougheed corridor. And as Councillor Carreras mentioned, the further west you go, the easier it gets. Further east, the more difficult. So we have to unfortunately take that into consideration, which, and I like the comparison to other communities as far as vehicles go, because we hear often, why is it that people drive SUVs and trucks in Maple Ridge? Is it because they really want to, or is it just the fact that we have a larger number of families, which means they can have one vehicle if they have an SUV or a truck? There's a whole host of reasons. So we have to always, when we compare it to other cities, I guess my point is there is a uniqueness about Maple Ridge still because of some of our limitations. So we have to factor that in. The EV charging, I do like the advancement on that, and I'm happy to hear. I wasn't sure about the charging the heads either, so it is just Tesla. So I mean, it makes sense. I think that people provide their own charging unit, but it's to the point that they can actually literally plug in. So I like that. The accessibility parking, I absolutely love that, because more and more people are having to use, I see it all the time, where you have somebody coming out of a van and it's almost impossible for them to get out without encroaching on the parking stall beside and do it safely. Or they're coming out into the corridor of where everybody is driving through. So I think that's really good. The scooters is an interesting one. But also it also talks about people in not the two-wheeled scooters, but the scooters where people really need a scooter to get around because they have walking limitations, correct? Yeah. So to me, I would want the focus on that for sure, because again, the number of seniors that I see more and more all the time on our roads with scooters. Some of them need to have some training on how to operate the scooters, but that's a separate issue altogether, especially with some of our curbs. I've watched a couple of times on Lougheed and 228, people that are driving there and they're going quite quickly, and they literally, the scooter is on two wheels. It's like, okay. So there's a couple of things there from an education point of view, but that's not our jurisdiction. And then I really like Councillor Schiller's comment about the home care, healthcare, because we're going to see more and more of that, particularly in our town center. And it is challenging. I see it all the time on 224. So where do they park? And they're always juggling for spots. So I don't know what that looks like, but it's certainly worth pursuing. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to staff through you. Thank you to staff and our consultant for all the work. It was a very thorough presentation. I imagine something like that takes a lot of work. I'm really in agreement with what a lot of my colleagues said about the neighborhood approach, having nuance the needs of residents, really keeping that in mind, and how the west side of Maple Ridge has a lot more transit accessibility and that sort of that forward-thinking nature that we need to hit. And when I was thinking about this, I was reflecting on the fact that maybe this is something you probably don't know about me, but one of my dreams is actually to drive a big F450 and parallel park very proficiently in the downtown core. And then when I was thinking, and I was like, there'll be so much fun. And when I was thinking about sort of what this means for me, and I think that parking, I think like we get into a lot of the specific details about parking, but I think what I'm really hearing about is about this idea of the quality of life of our residents, like what will really benefit folks to the largest degree. And when I think about parking, I'm very much a lay person with this, but I did some Googling and I kind of understand that parking is a lot of impact on many of the things we talked about, wanting to be an economic innovation hub, having a vibrant downtown, having a place where people feel comfortable. It's a fair amount of impact on our housing and on climate. And so that forward leading place that we want Maple Ridge to be and the things that we talk about in our strategic plan. So, and I really think about, that what can we realistically do as a suburban community, and I really think about, I don't know much about this, but I Googled around and I looked at like Kingston, Ontario, which has really thought about this in, quite a lot of detail. And I don't think Kingston, Ontario, Banff, and have really looked at this and about their impact on like different businesses and housing. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that I would love to see parking not in so much in isolation. And you asked what council would like to see. And for me personally, I would like to see parking talked about in the context of what does it mean for a vibrant downtown? What does it mean for housing? What does it mean for climate? What does it mean for an economic development standpoint? And I think that really for me, I think parking is a lot like lower taxes. For me, if you ask me whether I want lower taxes, I'm like, yes, I'm the first person to say yes. And I think that what we don't, and then of course, like everything we do around the table, there are trade-offs to that. So I would love to hear in the next time the staff report comes back, like, what does that mean? If we increase parking, what does parking mean? How does that affect our livability? How does that affect sort of how all these things that we care so much about that we're trying to make advancements on, and I think about, to Councillor Carreras' point, like I see that there were research made into what different suburbs have done. And I would love to see that fleshed out. What has Kingston done, which I understand has really tried to do something with their parking policy? What has something like Edmonton done? And like what trade-offs have they faced? I did more Googling because I guess that's what you do in prepping for a council meeting. And I was looking at this tiny town of Auburn, Maine, which is something like a population of 24,000. So they're not a very transit-friendly city. And they were facing, because of COVID, many of their local businesses were shuttering. And so the city had to really, the local Chinese buffet place went down, like this went down, the pizza place went down, on and on, like this sort of dropping like flies. And they were saying, okay, so what can we do to bring all these businesses back? And one thing they looked at was the upfront cost of parking to developers and to businesses. So I would really love to, and then after they implemented some parking minimum changes, they found that businesses were reinvesting in the community. And so going from businesses shutting down during the pandemic, businesses were opening back up. So I would really love to understand, I feel like a conversation about parking in isolation would be like, yes, lower taxes, more parking, me. Like who doesn't love all that great stuff, all that stuff, right? But also like really I just want to make sure I really understand what this means for every other aspect of our strategic plans. So really coming back, if folks could really flesh that out for us and really compare it to suburbs who have really done this sort of deep thinking, I think would be really useful. And I think that's the largest portion that I want to see. And I want to understand too in our context. I understand that Metro Vancouver, more Googling, that in 2018, Metro Vancouver did a study and they found that a fair amount of apartment buildings had fairly low parking utilization rates, like 35 to 45% of
of occupancy rates in their apartment building parkings. And I certainly wouldn't want to pass that kind of cost, the developer that gets passed to the homeowner, in perpetuity and like reduces housing. Like I wouldn't want that. And no one wants any of our space to be poorly used. So I just want to make sure that I really understand that kind of data before it comes back. Like what has Metro Vancouver found? Like if there's been that much underutilization of parking space, I think we should be really thoughtful about that because I just can't imagine like people like new homeowners coming to us and saying like, well, like my parkade was barely used, is not used very much, or it's like half empty most of the time. And the developer tells me that like you passed a lot of those costs were passed to us. Like, and now I have like a $1 million mortgage or whatever. Like I want to make sure I really understand those trade-offs before I really dive deeply into the details of like, is it 0.75 units? Is it 1.35 parking spaces per unit or whatever? So more context on that would be good. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Brings us to the end of round one. So I'll throw in my questions. Colleagues have shared a lot of the same things I'm thinking about here, but there's two areas that when we talk about accessibility, if we look down by Memorial Peace Park, for example, and I had this conversation with somebody who is in a wheelchair. We have these posts that are along 224th, and I don't know when they went in, but they seem to be in the way of people trying to get out of their cars, especially the ones who have mobility challenges. So if they're in a wheelchair, it does give them a bit of a crunch. So I'm looking for the connection between the actual ability to park, let's say downtown, and the mobility issue, and what role do these posts have to play? If you can shed any light on that.
So through the chair, with the new parking bylaw, we're hoping to not only widen the accessibility parking, but add that access aisle. We can definitely include a provision about any kind of obstructions around. It's very typical especially for underground parking that, the parking space needs to be a certain distance away from, a supporting wall, for example. And so we can definitely include a provision for surface parking, for example. In terms of the posts that currently exist, I think that's a little bit more of the engineering wheelhouse, but we can definitely include provisions moving forward. So it's not something that continues.
So, I mean, I understand if you are designated a spot as for micro mobility or for accessibility, right? But there's a lot of folks that just park in normal spots. And that's where this becomes a challenge. If you don't want to tell somebody who's driving around a van that has a wheelchair that, well, you can only park in the accessibility section. So in our underground parking lot, those are great. You have no posts, plenty of room to move around. But on the streets, I don't want to get to the point where we're saying you can only park in this spot. I think that takes away from the intent of where we're trying to go with that. The second thing is tweets. So a lot of folks I talk to in the Albion area and all those areas there, the neighborhood started off great, but then once they started adding in extra suites, now all of a sudden your demand for car spaces has increased. So have we taken into consideration anything that speaks to secondary suites?
So through the chair, for example, Albion, it's one of the neighborhoods that is zoned R3 that don't actually permit secondary suites. So they weren't designed to have that the extra parking. So the overflow we definitely see onto our streets. Moving forward, like we're exploring expanding where secondary suites could go. But right now we do require one parking space for the secondary suite occupant across the city right now. We're looking to potentially remove that only within the town center in order to increase that walkability. But if somebody has a legal suite, they are supposed to have a parking spot for that occupant.
Okay, thank you. And finally, my last comment is along the transit corridors. And to an extent, our downtown core. I'm actually for the number that you provided, I think was 75%
For the tandem?
for the town center.
Through the chair, the number for the big reduction for tandem or
No, not tandem,
Okay.
just
the 20% for the town center and transit, the LT cap.
yeah, I like when we look at where we're going to be 10 years from now, right? At the rate of our growth, we could be adding 10 to 20,000 more residents, which would likely equal more cars. There is no way we're going to ever be able to accommodate that many more cars. So at some point, we have to start to do exactly what we're doing now. And that is encouraging folks who don't want to drive to move to a downtown area where our transit corridors are trying to be beefed up. Because we just won't be able to put that many cars on the road. So I think if we start thinking about this conversation now, rather than 10 years from now, it may actually save us some grief down the line. So I think a lot of the things you've presented to us are in the right direction. We just have to make sure that the reasons for doing it are the right reasons. And I am curious to understand the climate portion of this. If we've considered what this would do to help reduce GHGs. Does it reduce GHGs? Do we have any data at all when it comes to those sort of things? So I think we're in the right direction here. I commend staff on tackling a lot of areas and separating, especially the downtown core, and in looking at the regional plans as well. I think that's important as well. So good stuff so far. Looking forward to what you're able to come back to us with. Round two, any takers? Councillor Tam.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to make some quick points here. I just want to give a big shout out to the Transportation Advisory Committee that really grappled with the parking considerations. And thank you to staff who prepared a really great presentation and really this workshop piece where the Transportation Advisory Committee members, we sat down and sort of grapple with this thing of, we all want lots of parking because it increases convenience, less walking to places, and then also grappling with and what does that mean? And it was really quite a hard conversation. And we had 2 hours for our committee meeting. And then I think we got through 3 of the 10 things, the 10 questions that we wanted to get through because it's just such a big topic. So thank you to TAC for putting all that work in. And just to support what the mayor said about the transit corridors and all that work that we're trying to do to beef that up, and sort of moving that forward, moving motion. I just wanted to just check into about sort of where the province is going with EVs and the province is going with e-bikes and making sure that our capacity and sort of what we're doing matches, aligns with what the province and where the feds are going, looking at their transportation plans and looking at their EV sales plans and sort of where that projection is going and making sure it does keep up with that. And just another small point in terms of the organizations we're consulting with, I think that's a good start to the list, and also adding the folks who came to the housing summit. So as a follow-up and suggestion of respect to them, the BC Co-op Housing Federation, the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, and the BC Nonprofit Housing Association. Again, just a nod to those folks who came up and shared their knowledge. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Seeing no other comments or questions or speakers, thank you, Ms. Gowan, for your great presentation. Looking forward to what you come back to us with. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on to item 5.2, Madam Clerk.
Next item 5.2, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and Amanda Grockwich, Manager of Community Planning, is here to present the item.
Step on up.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. So today we are here to briefly go over the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund program that is currently open and hopefully get a nod from council to be able to apply to the fund with the attached action plan as it relates to housing and some supply and systemic changes. So very briefly, the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund has been brought forward by the federal government, intending to incentivize local governments to encourage initiatives within their jurisdiction that will be focused on increasing housing supply with the overall intent of supporting the development of complete low carbon and climate resilient communities. In order to access the funding of the Housing Accelerator Fund, municipalities must submit an application to the CMHC by August 18th. So the deadline is during the council break with a council approved action plan, which is why we're here today. So overall, this fund at a national level has about $4 billion available. So this is a very significant investment by the federal government. And the applications are going to be evaluated based on how many additional units we'll be able to provide within our community over and above our current expectations within 3 years. So it's a very interesting set of parameters and criteria. In terms of Maple Ridge, we're looking, as I mentioned, over 3 years and roughly an additional 450 units for our community. So staff have put together a Housing Accelerator Fund action plan. This is a terminology used by the grant itself. It's really a list of initiatives that we would be working on over the next couple of years. The action plan has been developed in alignment with our existing housing action plan and needs report, as well as providing some flexibility to be able to accommodate any changes coming down the line from the province, as well as reflecting what we've heard to date through some of our service improvement reports that have been taking place over the last couple of years, and of course, council strategic plan. So in theory, given that we're looking at roughly 2 to 3 years, this would be a medium-term roadmap for what we'd be able to work on as it relates to housing. And Appendix A of the document attached for this report included the full 21 initiatives that are broken down over the 7 categories. So the 7 categories are on the screen before you. I'm happy to take any questions specifically as they relate to these initiatives, but just really broadly, what we're looking for is essentially to optimize our improve some of our systems. So this is going to be looking at how we process information internally, where we're able to use digital transformation to kind of help improve those processes. You've heard many of these reports before over the last couple of years, so it's really taking that and pushing it a little bit further. It's also capitalizing on what was or has been presented as the concierge role. So we've expanded that to include a couple of additional catered services. This will be tailored specifically to housing and those more complex development application files. And then the next 2 to 4 items really speak to a lot of the material that you would find in our housing action plan today. So it does include taking a closer look at what our community needs are. We've heard loud and clear that we need to take a closer look based on the 21 census data and COVID. So that work item is incorporated into this action plan. And based on how the grant is designed, you get additional funds if you focus on infill housing, missing middle, and transit-oriented communities. So this is why we have scoped some of our initiatives under these headings. It is to help us get additional funding. So we're going to be looking at further ways to support development within our existing neighborhoods. So this would be in the area of your secondary suites, your detached garden suites. The missing middle is going to be really what the province bring forward. How do we expand those 3 to 8 units on an existing residential lot? And then the multifamily development is going to be focused largely on the town center and the Lougheed transit area. What type of mixed use buildings are we going to be able to put in there that will facilitate those complete communities? And then it's a very small line on the screen before you, but there's going to be quite a bit of work behind it that's going to look at the servicing requirements to essentially unlock these strategic investments throughout the community. So definitely a nod to an engineering department for putting quite a bit of work in to figure out what this could look like. So again, happy to take any specific questions about these initiatives. The recommendations before you are essentially to ask us to move forward with the grant application. And should any additional information become available between now and August 18th, that the CAO would be able to make any amendments to the action plan as necessary.
Thank you very much. Can I get a motion to move the recommendations? Moved by Councillor Duick, seconded by Councillor Youssef. I just want to ask if maybe you can expand a little bit on. I get the $4 billion in the Housing Accelerator Fund. We're not actually building stuff. So where would this money go? So you're applying for money. How did that apply to the overall process of getting stuff built?
So through the grant, we can use the funds for a range of activities. We are able to use some of the funding to implement the action plan. So of course, that's certainly a possibility. We can also use the funding to support affordable housing, housing-related infrastructure, and community-related infrastructure. So one of the tables in the report essentially lists all the type of infrastructure that we are able to use the funding for. It is very broad. What we choose to use the funding for would likely be layered between council strategic plan as well as our capital planning. The funds come out on a tiered approach. We get a little bit at the beginning and a little bit at the end and some in the middle. So depending where we are in our capital planning processes, it will be able to go towards recreational facilities. It can go for active transportations. It can go towards studies. It is quite broad.
Okay, so I get that. I'm just trying to understand because we're always talking about the housing component. So is there a direct connection? I get the infrastructure on the side, but is there a direct connection to the actual housing component?
In terms of what we can use the funds for?
Yeah.
It is available to us if we choose to do so, but it's not a requirement. We do not have to use the money for the action items listed through the application or to build housing.
I guess where I'm trying to go is, can we use the money for that? And how would we use the money to encourage more densification of housing?
So if we chose to use the funds specifically for the housing accelerator fund action plan, there are a couple of items in there that really spoke to incentivization. So we could implement some incentive programs. It would also be used to fund the supporting software that we use to do digital plan review and some of these other transformation things. So a portion of the funds would be used from a systemic change perspective, and then the other portion could be used from an encouraging supply perspective.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Thank you. Open it up for questions, please. Councillor Youssef, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff for the presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Overall, very supportive of the action plan and what's been put together, and I commend staff on putting together quite an extensive action plan that not only looks at the housing component of this particular funding stream, but also the infrastructure and knock-on effects, if you will, throughout the community. With our digital plan submission system, through the chair to staff, were we not already doing that during the pandemic?
Through the chair, yes, there are components of this that we have already done. Again, the grant is very broad in terms of what we can include in terms of initiatives, and some in-progress work can be included. So what we're kind of hoping to do is take the work that we've been doing and essentially push it even farther with the additional funds that may be able to support.
Good. That's comforting to know that we have been still using the digital plan submission system, and it didn't just go away when the pandemic somewhat went away. Secondly, through the chair, how far are we on upgrading our development application software? Is that work commenced at all, or are we still struggling with the Amanda system?
Through the chair, that process is still ongoing.
Thank you for that. And I have some information that I'll be sharing with the CEO tomorrow from the FCM, a lot of different software development companies, as well as organizations that have worked in this field. And I think we'll be at the front of that pack. Lastly, through the chair, again, being a big fan of area and neighborhood specific plans, I'm happy to see that we have a component built in here, an action item to put together those pre-approved plans. I think that'll go a long way in expediting our processes and of course in bringing forward the housing that this is meant to encourage and have our city bringing online. Thank you again for all the work that's gone into this. I do endorse your action plan moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Councillor Carreras, followed by Councillor Tan, followed by Councillor Schiller.
Thank you. I support this. I would say that anytime we can get additional funding, we jump up and down and we do everything we can to get it. We never want to pass up any sort of funding. I do like that there's some pieces to the plan that utilizes that one-time funding that this would be for actual long-term implemented changes. And so I think it's future thinking, and although this isn't really talk about sort of the actual sort of brick and mortar of a housing, is talking about how we create the landscape that encourages and allows for the additional housing to be built, whether that be not-for-profits or developers or whatever it is. It allows for the sort of multi-use or multi-housing landscape we need in our community, and it gets our city ready to be able to go forward. So I do support that. I do have a question though, just because I accelerate laneless infill housing development. Can you just sort of talk a little bit about
What that means?
about that? Yeah. I don't know what laneless, just curious.
So a lot of the secondary suite and coach house material that is available regionally works a little bit easier if you have a lane. Based on the City of Maple Ridge's development pattern, we have quite a bit of housing without lanes at the back of their properties, and we run into some unique challenges in figuring out how to fit the 2 to 3 units on the lot, the parking, the servicing, and making sure it all works together. So because some of the neighborhoods do share very specific characteristics, the intent of this would be staff to take a bit of the front end and look at how we can make it work on those lots to essentially help speed up the process and make it a little bit easier for the developments coming in. Typically speaking, if they're looking at a secondary suite or a coach house or a detached garden suite, it is a little bit more of those family homes. So it isn't necessarily a big developer with a lot of experience. So we're just trying to kind of shorten the learning curve a little bit. And then if we can get ahead of any of the servicing requirements or stormwater management, that would also be looped into that part of the conversation. It's just really recognizing that we have some unique geography and anything that we can do to kind of expedite the process.
Perfect. Thank you. And when you talk about sort of smaller individuals, I've heard us speak about that before. So I get that in the concept. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Tan, followed by Schiller and followed by Councillor Doze. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Overall, as my colleague said, very supportive of this. Thank you. It's a comprehensive plan. Some small comments. Just to refer to what Councillor Youssef has alluded to in previous meetings, this idea of complete community. I wonder if there's action items that we can put in here around how to facilitate sort of I'm just trying to find a word that is not controversial these days, sort of amenities within walking distance, or sort of the corner store, bring back the corner store in neighborhoods. I would be curious to see if there's sort of action items we can do to facilitate that kind of thing, knowing that a lot of our residents still have to drive to, pick up milk or pick up eggs or that kind of thing. So that's one small piece there. Another piece is the below market component. And I really take Councillor Duick's point from previous meetings about how there is a filtering effect. At what point, like almost nothing is affordable these days, and that if we do build housing sort of at a higher spectrum, that it's sort of those folks aren't competing for housing sort of at the lower end of the spectrum, and it does sort of help with the entire system. And I also just to add to that. Looking at this plan, seeing if looking at this action plan, maybe adding a piece there, a component of what it looks like to facilitate that below market housing. Because I mean, like, who can afford anything at market rent nowadays? Like certainly not on a councillor's stipend. So like, what can we Like just looking to understand what we can do to facilitate that below market, whether it's nonprofit, whether it's for profit, doesn't sort of matter to me, but sort of facilitating that lower end. Because I noticed a lot of points in this action plan are sort of that, you know, detached or semi-detached or missing middle, which is great for folks who can afford that, and many of us can't. And the other piece is also seniors and youth housing, because I know all of us are told how bad the seniors and youth housing crisis is. I mean, the word crisis gets thrown around all the time now, but for seniors and youth. So that's it for me. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Councillor Schiller, please.
Thank you, Mayor Rumi, and thank you to staff for responding to this so quickly. This is a tight turnaround time. I'm very supportive of us moving ahead with the application and really appreciate the work that went into responding to it. I do appreciate the opportunity for us to really invest in our own systems. The concierge program especially, I think, just gives us an opportunity to really build to get the kind of housing we want where we want it, and to be able to accelerate that work, I think is a great opportunity. And I'm very happy to hear as well that we do have the option of looking at investing in the infrastructure that all this additional housing really requires to keep Maple Ridge a livable community. So I'm very supportive. And my only question is just if we have a sense of when we might hear back about successful applications.
Through the chair, I appreciate CMHC has set a very ambitious target. So our closing date is the middle of August, and our understanding is they will be reaching out to municipalities by the end of September in terms of contract awards. And then presumably we are supposed to have everything signed and dotted by the end of the year if we are a successful municipality. So they are very much, they have committed quite a bit of resources to this, so it should be a relatively quick time frame.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Doze. Councillor Doze, can you hear?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Chair. I just wanted to ask a direct question through you to staff. I want to know if the Housing Restoration Fund could be applied towards the acquisition of land for non-profit or low-income housing, as the case might be.
Okay. Through the chair, yes, the acquisition of land for affordable housing is listed as a potential funding use under the grant framework.
Okay. So this being the case, I want to say that I would like to see Maple Ridge go out in full force to apply for this fund and possibly get it, because housing cannot go anywhere if you don't have land available. And one of the things I see that has become a very serious impediment to improvement of housing supply in the community has always been the availability of land. And if we can get that at a reasonable rate from this kind of sources, I think it can also help to lead to a more affordable housing for most of our folks. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And just for the purposes of understanding and clarification, the October 18th deadline, if we approve today, then we're actually approving CAO to submit it. We're done. We move forward, and then you what? August 18th, yeah. So that would allow everybody to move forward on this initiative. Okay, any other further questions, Councillor Chan?
Thanks, Mayor. Just a quick question. I'm just noticing that, just to make sure I understand, I'm noticing that the recommendations are that the CAO be authorized to approve any changes to the action plan in support of this application. So am I understanding that the action plan will be modified based on the comments from around the table today? That's a nod. Great, wonderful, thank you. So this is not, just to make sure I triple understand that this draft action plan is not a finalized plan, that it will, like the comments will be taken into account. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Any other further comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? And it is unanimous. Motion has been carried. Thank you very much. Great job. Go get us money now. No correspondence, no questions from council. Seeing none, no matters deemed expedient, seeing none. Well, then we have no further business. So we will adjourn. We will be back. It is 12:20. We'll be back for close. Is 1 o'clock enough time for everybody? Yeah. Oh, you can stay here if you like. Okay. So we'll adjourn and